Otherwise, I'll move forward by introducing the next panel. It's called Feminist Archives. And we have Uhuru Palafala presenting a paper titled The Matri Archive in Radical Political Imaginaries of Southern Africa. Then we have Viseni Moyo and Juliet Perumla, who will be presenting Understanding African Women's Experiences, followed by Faith Mkwecha, Decoloniality, Prophecy, and Haunting in Gender and the Nation Constructions in Zimbabwe. I'm truly excited to be chairing this panel, Feminist Archives. I'll hand it over to you, Uhuru.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here presenting a paper at this iteration of Afems, which is my first. So I'm very excited. I'd like to extend love and solidarity to everybody in the room. It's lovely to see familiar faces and names. So today, you can hear me just fine?
Yes.
Lovely, thank you. So today I'm going to be presenting on the question of the Matri Archive in South African radical political imaginaries of the Black world. Hopefully all of these issues and new kind of terminologies and geographies that I'm mentioning here will be unpacked clearly as I go along. So I'm going to be in conversation with Cedric Robinson to enter a dialogue on the Black Cosmological Archive in order to then situate what I call the Matri Archive and define it from within that archive. Chair, I'm not quite sure how long I have. Is it 15 or 20 minutes? Just so I know where to skip and how to move.
Thank you for that question. I just learned that the third panelist is not joining us. So we can do, we at 35, we can do 20 minutes per presentation.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much.
Then we'll have enough time for questions. All right.
Thank you. Okay, so my way into this discussion is through citing Edward Glissant's critique of colonial science and its apparatus of classification and categorization as having undermined the integrity of the whole and the totality of this world. My work so far in academia has been interested in exiled South Africans living in the Black world. I have studied the Black radical traditions and intellectual cultures in the 19th and 20th century. This work led me to begin investigating other forms of exile. Exile from the whole and the totality of that attends the world that Glissant speaks of, and which our ancestors have known and lived. I'm going to call this the Black Cosmological Archive, which is a way into a tradition of thinking, being, knowing, and relating in the world that is governed by various orientations to each other, to self, and to the living world. The Black Cosmological Archive holds the philosophies of interconnectedness, interrelationality, and interdependence between all living matter. I'm thinking with Sylvia Winter in tasking us to think of new worlding, a world-making force that began in 1492, as having brought with it its own cosmological archive, one that enshrined its own sacred mythology in the form of creation narratives, its medicinal practices, its spiritual beliefs, its philosophies of being that are attended by the Cartesian split, its languages, and perhaps most importantly, its well-defined category of the human, who constitutes the human, and crucially, who does not. And of course, I don't feel like I have to rehash the spectacular violence that New Worlding cosmology engendered to this audience. I want to relate Glissant's observation of the undercutting of totality to Cedric Robinson's thesis in Black Marxism, in which he argues that African labor was being drawn into the orbit of the world system through the transatlantic slave trade. That to understand the dialectic of African resistance to enslavement and exploitation, we need to look outside the orbit of capitalism into West Africa. This is where, in my view, Robinson articulates a useful archive of Black cosmology that uniquely defines the Black radical tradition. I'm quoting from Robinson now. Quote, Marx had not realized fully that the cargoes of laborers also contained African cultures, critical mixes and admixtures of language and thought, of cosmology and metaphysics, of habits, beliefs, and morality. These were the actual terms of their humanity. These cargoes then did not consist of intellectual isolates or deculturated Blacks, or men, women, and children separated from their previous universe. African labor brought the past with it, a past that had produced it and settled on it the first elements of consciousness and comprehension. Close quotes. I want to bring this closer to home to think about Black radicalism in Southern Africa, to argue for a view of resistance that encompasses home culture, language, and customs as vehicles for first comprehension of subjectivity, history, and politics. To be clear, I want to argue that to understand Black South African resistance to their exploitation, Black Southern Africans' resistance to their exploitation, we need to look outside the orbit of their oppression too. Here we can surface an archive that produces philosophies of being in the world within a non-separatist framework that espouses and venerates totality and wholeness against the separatists' oppositional binary and Manichaean logic of the West. Those born of and socialized in and entangled in their ongoing becoming by this universe and its cosmologies have access to this other world, another way of being and knowing. In Southern Africa, it is Ntu philosophy that shapes that universe. It is Ntu philosophy that from which the Black cosmological archive of Southern Africa emerges. Ntu is a life force or spirit that pervades all living matter. And Ntu philosophy is underpinned by poetics of interconnectivity, interrelationality, and independence between humans and non-humans, the larger living world and the cosmos. In Ntu cosmology, the human comprises or is constituted by the living dead, and the not yet born. It's what Ramose Mogobe calls an ontotriadic structure of being. My work grapples with the existence of these other worlds that are accessible to proponents of Ntu conscientization in the Southern African context. My proposition at a basic level is that those worlds couch and enshrine ways of being and knowing self and the world that are other to the Eurocentric, patriarchal, and hierarchical orientation to self, each other, and the human, non-human living world and cosmos. Christina Sharp reminds us that we are not only known to ourselves and to each other by that force. So my overall premise is that those worlds, the universes of the Black cosmological archive, are constituted and defined by a matriarchal orientation, which I call the matriarchive. I aim to show how the matriarchive in Southern Africa instructed a Black radicalism that was, and here I'm in conversation with Robinson again, a Black radicalism that was a negation of Western civilization, but not in the direct sense of a simple dialectical negation. It was also preoccupied with the integral totality of the people themselves. My site of investigation and analysis are mostly indigenous languages of the lands that also constitute the Black cosmological archive, and in my view, are a critical archive to study these philosophies and the understanding of communal relations that shaped a communitarian Black radical tradition, and also of studying and understanding temporality, death, land, birth, revolution, space, and so forth in a manner that is different from the Eurocentric patriarchal one. I cite Cedric Robinson here again in his assertion that the ultimate goal of revolutionary violence was not material conquest, moral vengeance, or political dominance, but rather, and I'm here quote Robinson, it most often was turned inward. It most often was turned inward, the community against its material aspect. This violence was not inspired by an external object. It was not understood as a part of an attack on a system or an engagement with an abstraction of oppressive structures and relations. Rather, and this is where Robinson then becomes relevant to my study, rather it was our nongqawuse, the renunciation of actual being for historical being, the preservation of the ontological totality granted by a metaphysical system that had never allowed for property in either the physical, philosophical, temporal, legal, social, or psychic sense. Close quote. And we can, the nongqawuse reference is loaded. I'm not going to speak to it right now. So the preservation of ontological totality granted by an interconnectedness with an interdependence on the ontotriad of the living dead, and the not yet born was the fundamental nature or characteristic of South African Black radicalism. This radicalism should not be exclusively understood within the particular context of its genesis, which is, through the orbit of white supremacist patriarchal capitalism, but also through the historical impulse and ethic to preserve totality, to foster historical continuities, and to ground the living in the memories and desires of the living dead. These social functions that are at once political were the domain of women, who presided over ritual materials, history, its preservation and transmission, and over matters of spirituality that governed ceremonies whose function was to perform or embody historical being over actual being. And it's worth noting that some scholars have furthered Robinson's scholarship by looking at how, for instance, women's spiritual power were central to something like the Haitian Revolution. In his introduction to Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, Robin D.G. Kelly poses a set of questions that drive this research. How has gender and sexuality shaped Black revolt? How do we interpret the fact that Black women were often invested with great spiritual powers? Close quotes. I centralize the matriarchive in my work as a bedrock of Black revolutionary thought and revolt in Southern Africa. And today I'll focus on two writers, just for illustration, who are preeminent in politics of global Blackness and its radical traditions. And they are Solomon Plaatje and Masisi Kunene. I will place them in conversation with, respectively, with W.E.B. Du Bois in the case of Sol Plaatje and Amy Césaire in the case of Masisi Kunene. But prior to that, I want to put them in conversation with their mothers, their grandmothers, great aunts. It is important to note Ntongela Masilela's important work in which he labels these writers that I've just mentioned as the new Africans. And of course, he's putting it in conversation with the new Negroes, the new Negro movement. I read this, Ntongela Masilela's moniker, as also pointing us to the inverse, the old African, and argue for the continuities, entanglements, and synthesis of this old world and the new world, that they coexist and are entangled. I am invested in locating Masisi Kunene and Sol Plaatje's grandmothers and mothers, as they do, I'm not superimposing, they do as foundational to the cosmological knowledge that shapes their work and politics. I recast the home place as a critical site of these knowledges. I'm drawing home place from Bell Hooks's work, home place as a site for resistance. I recast the home place as a critical site of these knowledges, their embodiment and practice. I work with the concept of the matriarchive to reread the dialogue between Plaatje and Du Bois by centering the influence of his mother, grandmother, and grand aunt in his lifelong advocacy of indigenous cultures and their shaping of a Black political imagination. How does Mhudi, for instance, become par exemplar of this consciousness? And how do we use this gender-raised politicization to rethink Black radical traditions from the South? So I want to pause and just offer some definitions of the matriarchive. I'm going to offer only two, but in my book, I kind of explore other definitions and applications. I will offer two that are immediately relevant to the case studies at hand. So I will focus on two definitions in the interest of time. The first definition is invested in a para-ontological Blackness. Fred Moten offers a generative distinction between Black as a constructed political ontology fashioned in the cauldron of colonial encounter, and Black as para-ontology, as preceding the political ontological moment, and thereby beyond the symbolic order of white hegemony. I'm invested in both iterations and excavate Southern African cosmological archives to mine forms of humanity that predate colonialism, but at the same time have not ossified in the past, but were entangled and synthesized with the continuity of the historical imperative. Scholars like Amilcar Cabral and in contemporary Black feminist scholarship, Maria Lugones, argue that our ways, of course, exist among the majority of the people, and some scholars like Robin Shilliam argue that the culture still exists in the rural setting, and those are the cultures that should be unveiled and unleashed in an articulation of a revolutionary struggle. I locate the rural as foundational to a particular tenor of cultural and political sensibilities and imaginaries that shaped Black radical traditions, with women central to rituals of continuity, enfolding and synthesizing the historical imperative with those of the present futures, with bridging memory and desire, with bridging history and present future. And in my book, I call this practice gathering work. That is the first definition of a matriarchive. And it has to do with also the history of the advent of racial capitalism, in which, of course, the women were heading households at times in the absence of men who were in the mines and later on in exile. The second definition of the matriarchive follows a crucial directive by Oyoronke Oyewumi and pertains centering experiential difference and cultural variance in de-universalizing Western conceptions of motherhood, the family, and community. Here, the roles and position of women in the family and larger social organization are instructive. The work of scholars like Babalwa Magogwana points out the role of umakhulu and firstborn females in Xhosa communities, in the Vavenda communities, in the Bapedi communities. Umakhulu, Umafungwashe, Umakhadzi, and Rakhadi, who all invariably shape and negotiate family dynamics in rituals and social organization. Further, rituals and ceremonies were often headed by older women who presided over ritual artifacts, which were the family's precious and spiritually significant items that were nucleic to the spiritual well-being of lineages and societies at large. And think about the Black world, how these traveled across the Atlantic. Women would plate various things, seeds, objects, artifacts in the hair of their children, so that they may be able to cross over with these heirlooms. Their curatorial care in preserving and transmitting material, ritual, oral, and immaterial heirlooms that have in turn fueled resistance politics, concerned with not only negation of Western civilization, but also the integral totality of the people, will be illustrated in the two case studies I will discuss today. And maybe I only have time to discuss one. How am I doing, or time? I see somebody.
Yes, I just shared it's time. Thank you so much, Uhuru.
Sure.
That's a very rich and interesting talk, and I'm sure there'll be many questions during the Q&A session. Next up, we have Zveseni Moyo with the talk titled Understanding African Women's Experiences. Zveseni, I'm handing over to you. Thank you, Uhuru.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair. Hello, everybody. I'm trying to see if I can share my screen. Okay. Yes, there is my topic, moving towards indigenization of knowledge, understanding African women's experiences. So this paper or this study was motivated by the effort to contribute to ways in which African contextual matters can be understood. And the paper examines how African women's experiences can be understood through localized theories within the African context, and also through an effort to make a contribution to questioning the legitimacy of Western and Anglo-centric knowledge as the universal source of authority, and also in an effort to contribute to developing our own theories on which to base our own literature as a continent. And so this analysis is located within the premise that the taken for granted epistemological privilege and capitalist development strategies have relegated African knowledge to the shadows. So this is our effort to make a contribution to that effort. And also the field of African feminism as a whole has long been ignored because of its failure to renounce tradition and to expand its terrain to the global village. So we tried to chart the issues here and we discovered that in the literature, we actually reviewed the literature, the existing literature, and we found that there are problematic issues with African feminisms. Actually, the first one is that they have failed to question some features of traditional African culture. And even if they have questioned them, but they have failed to totally denigrate them. And also, the established biological differences of men and women are reflected in the organization of gender roles and that are constructed according to these differences between men and women. And also, women are treated as inferior to men, and they are placed at the bottom of the power hierarchy. And also, instead of charting ideas underpinned by reaction, African feminisms should have, from the beginning, scrutinized the root causes of gendered power hierarchies. So, for instance, their language of African feminisms is they use language like collaborate, negotiate, compromise, and this runs counter to the language of the Western feminists, which is like, for example, they use words like challenge, disrupt, deconstruct, blow apart, etc. So African feminists need more than just negotiating and accommodating and compromising. And their lenience with culture that has crafted patriarchal social structures and systems, inaugurating male supremacy. So to challenge the cultural ideology of male dominance, there is need for an analytical framework that can highlight and overturn the source of the system of patriarchal oppression and exploitation. So although African feminists claim to liberate women from patriarchal oppression, they have failed to do the following: that its pluralistic nature of African feminists has been viewed as the failure to foreground one single theory that represents the whole of Africa, and also they have failed to blend with global trends, and also they've been blamed for being reactionary. You know, these African feminisms were born out of reacting to the Western feminist theories, and also that they have failed to renounce culture So while it's revisiting the African feminisms, we found that the reactionary nature born out of a sense of despair and anger against Western feminist patronage is silent about the ills within African traditional culture that subjugates women. And also there is no clear distinction between exposing the flaws of African culture and safeguarding the customs, which has reaffirmed and extended masculine control over women. So as long as African feminist theories remain definable and reactionary against Western feminist theories, they lose the potential to guide theory, practice, and research on liberating women, associating with the common historical background of colonialism. And also we find that there is a need for urgent need to examine how culture is a negative force for transformational change. And also, African feminists should draw the world's attention to the understanding that the African context is ready to produce knowledge valuable enough to impact social change, and also should challenge the current theoretical concepts. So as academics, as activists, as scholars, we must be seen to challenge the current theoretical concepts. And therefore, African feminists need to revisit, needs a revisit, because they are an offshoot of the Euro-American experiences. And women are subordinated. This is the reality within our African continent, that women are subordinated in their biological families by fathers, brothers, and uncles, and also in their marriages by their husbands, sons, and in-laws. That is, if they live with their husbands' families. And also that's the question we pose here is, how do we expect women to gain the status of power in such a status? So in our effort to look at the loopholes or the gaps within the African feminist theories, so we see that there is a need for us for the building on the indigenous, arguing that in effect, African worldviews we are capable of providing the theoretical rec on which to sorry, I lost my slide. Okay. So this is also supported by those theorists there. And so in our revisiting of these theories, the African feminisms, we saw it fit to add some dimensions, that is renouncing and critiquing tradition, as well as expanding the terrain to the global village, or to globalization. So in renouncing and critiquing tradition, we propose a dimension of renouncing tradition and critiquing practices that affect women, that is local relations on the terrain of tradition. And also we seek to overturn, or we propose an overturn of cultural norms that have constructed the image of women as powerless as compared to men, and has made them voiceless and permanently walking in the shadows of the patrimony inherent in the majority of African societies. And also, traditional practices and cultural norms have been constructed by a society dominated by patriarchal ideologies to keep women in a subservient position. And this has denied them their human rights. And also having a theory that traces the roots of women's subordination can bring to the fore the deep-seated gender stereotypes impeding women's advancement. And also as activists, we must interrogate the traditional ideologies of oppression embedded within customary practices, norms and values, and root out flaws that have subjugated women's social status. And also perspectives must be guided by women of all socioeconomic classes, including women residing in rural areas. I think that's very, very important. As researchers, activists, theorists, and scholars, we need to go to the villages and see how women are living their lives. Because women in rural areas, for instance, have suffered the highest level of consequences of traditional practices or traditional systems. So with the almost static nature of rural areas, how much are the women being empowered to fight patriarchal social systems? And also how much are they being informed about African feminist activist movement? And also this way, as activists, we can influence theory, practice, and research, and uplift the value of women. And in our dimension, as we proposed this dimension of expanding terrain to globalization, this dimension seeks to blend African women's experiences within the global village, and also social arrangements that recognize women cannot be confined to the continent of Africa. And experiences of African women are linked to those of women around the world. This is according to the African Feminist Charter of 2006. And there is an urgent need for a shift to theory that broadens gender structures, a second wave of recolonization from political to social colonization, because there is a wave, although Africa has conquered political colonization, but now we are faced with the social colonization. So we cannot be confined within our African continent, but to be immersed in the global village. So globalization puts pressure on the powerless position of women, and then the impact of economic exploitation. So women usually experience the more consequences of economic exploitation than other genders. And also detaching African feminists from their reactionary modes and relocating them to the global village necessitates the transformation of social arrangements and shift to liberating techniques. And also male domination has proved to be the source of social inequalities, which affects women. So our dimension, tracing the roots in the quest to find an Afrocentric angle, we consider the history of exclusion and discrimination across all axes of discrimination, that is, for instance, race, gender, class, and we advocate for tracing the roots of gender inequality. Where is the where are the roots of gender inequality? How can we deal with the causes of gender inequality? Of importance in this perspective is the family, community, and motherhood, which are deeply rooted in the African traditional culture. And these are central to the African women's experiences, and therefore tracing the roots can be a viable possibility for weakening oppression of women. So critiquing tradition strengthens methodology of the indigenous African continent in eradicating oppression of women. And tracing the roots identifies, defines, and denounces the patriarchal ideology supporting male dominance. And the gendered role of African women in the family and the community becomes foremost issue in the formation of this theory, because it is unique for women in the African continent. And all the issues affecting women can be traced to the family in which violence is experienced directly and indirectly in the community. For instance, according to Statistics South Africa in 2019, where 2,771 women were murdered in a 12-month period. So our conclusion, we find that tracing the roots is a theoretical consideration to unearth the multiple causes of women oppression. And it seeks to liberate women from patriarchal ideologies while decolonizing structures and mechanisms that subjugate women. Also, it uncovers gender stereotypes tied to their sexuality. And indeed, tracing the roots alongside socioeconomic issues deals with sexist issues and other forms of indigenous theory. And this is because the history of African women revolves around gender-based violence, poverty, and harsh economic conditions. And these are significant in African women's experiences. And also, it necessitates the accommodation of peculiarities trending in the gender discourse embedded in the experiences of African women. And this theoretical consideration can be included in the quest to see the roadmap to women's economic emancipation. I thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sviseni. Thank you. Now we're going to open it up to the Q&A. And we don't have questions yet, but if I can ask both Sviseni and Uhuru to come back on video so that, but we'll start with Uhuru. Okay, so Uhuru, thank you so much for the presentation on the Maitri Archive. We're truly grateful to even think about the ways in which oftentimes the male figures who are forefronted are drawing from their own matrilineal lineages. You didn't get to share the rest of your paper, which was a way in which you were showing how this occurs in your work. So I would love for you to speak into that a bit more. And I was very intrigued to hear how people like Sol Blackie draw on their grandmothers and great aunts and their activism and how they bring that into their work. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mandisa. Ooh, we are matching, yellow. I actually want to do the ethical thing and say that the concept matriarchal is not mine. So I first encountered it in Jacques Derrida's work, and it was furthered by Laura Grillo in her study of ritual in West Africa. I am adapting it to speak to something in Southern Africa and arguably in the Black world. So I'm very much interested in the Black cosmological archive. So what does that mean? That in our own lived experience, but certainly those who were born and grew up in the first half of the 20th century, and also mid-century, they know another world. So when I quote Christina Sharp to say we are known to each other, to ourselves and each other by another force, that force is quite prevalent here, precisely because there is that historical continuity that took place. And so in speaking about the Black cosmological archive, I am wanting to very much assert the existence of another world in this dominant paradigm of white hegemony. And that other world is known to us and I want to name it, is known to the writers that I'm looking at, from to Eskia Mphatlele, to Mazizi Kunene, to Sol Blakey, is known to them. And they, in fact, in their work, speak about their grandmothers, mothers, and great aunts as people who have, for instance, Masizi Kunene in Anthem of the Decades, which is an epic that he published in 1982, writes about how the history that is contained in his epic, and I quote, was deeply influenced by my great-grandmother, Makandeyana of the Nduli family. She was one of the greatest oral historians and narrators of legends that I have ever met. Knowledge is of the ancestors, she once said, meaning, so he says that I only began to understand when she commenced her teaching, covering not only the ideas of the origin of life, the authority of man on earth and medicine, but also the nature of words and their secret meanings. I apologize. I hope that the sound is not, you can hear me just fine. So I want to say her name in this space as well, Makandeya Nantuli, just to also, pay homage, as he does, in fact, to her broad knowledge of, as he says, not only the indigenous knowledges as couched in the language, but things as broad, fields as broad as medicine. And philosophy. So that's what I mean by I'm practicing a different way of reading and listening, actually, because it's not the reading that I as a vehicle or as an approach that I use to hear these women. It's more listening. And when these big figures of the Black radical tradition speak about their own practice and mention these women, I really want to attune my ear to hear them and to find them and to find their names and to see what it is that they have imparted on them, that they in turn transformed. That's hence the gathering work that I'm proposing, that they were, the women themselves were doing gathering work by imparting, curatorial work by transmitting these histories and these traditions to their children. And what they did was then bridge those knowledges into this world that we know and into the radicalism that we celebrate.
Yeah, I love how you attend, even in this response, to an archive that might not necessarily cannot actually be simply recorded in a library, or an archive that is not just read or even oral. An archive that is not necessarily embodied even. So these kind of multiple archival forms and citational ways of listening to citational practice, I think that's incredibly powerful. So when Mazizi Kunene writes his epic, we know by attuning the ear and attuning our eyes and our senses that he is not alone. He is writing it within a lineage of other, knowledges and practices and embodiments and spiritual, presence. So that's such a wonderful way to also attend to the ways in which the Western archive is very limited, because it doesn't have the spaciousness that you speak of in the Maitri archive and these cosmologies. I'm gonna switch over to
when he writes, sorry, just these epics, particularly of Kunene, are so interesting. So my approach is and my conversation with Cedric Robinson is that it offers me that this renunciation of actual being for historical being. So he is in the moment wanting to hear the community, wanting to hear this other world that he wants to assert in this dominant paradigm. And he writes in isiZulu first and then translates his work to English. And so I don't want to take up too much time, but then his relationship with Amy Césaire then becomes extremely important because he's coming with this archive, and Amy Césaire reads his work and thinks, this is what I've been looking for in this quest that I have expressed through surrealism. This is actually the thing. And he asks Masisi Kunene to write the introduction to Notebook to a Return of the Native Land. I will stop there.
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's really just an example of the ways in which the position of non-being can be extremely generative.
Right.
You know, and that it's not a dead end. It is quite capacious in such generative ways.
And non-being is not possible in that sense of a social death if you have access to this other world.
It's its own like vast copious vortex where so much then can occur. So I love that. I'm going to switch over to Dr. Zwiseni.
Yes,
we have a question for you, Dr. Zwiseni, if you can come on. We have a question. Thank you for your presentation and the ways in which we must always be incredibly... Oh, sorry, I'm reading the wrong question right now. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. Question for you, Dr. Zwiseni. There's a concern about the binary opposition that you make between African feminism and the global village being mapped onto a lack of theorization by African women. Are you saying that African women do not or cannot produce their own theory? And also, who is the we that you are citing in this regard in your presentation and its finding? You know, I think citational practice is quite important. So making visible who the we is that is being cited is important, and who these African feminists are that you're thinking of is also quite important. So looking forward to your responses.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, these are some of the gaps that we have we cited. That the first one is that on the definition of African feminism itself, yes, it was an offshoot from, it was a reaction from the Western feminist theories that, you know, as an African continent, we've been left out. So some scholars or some African feminists put forward some theories, many of them. So rather than concentrating on a single theory for the whole of Africa, so they went on to make them several of them, you know, according to their own nations, according to their own cultures. But the bottom line is, as a continent, we are experiencing the same, we are affected by the same issues as a continent. Women are affected the same way on the African continent. So, and also that we feel that the authors of this paper, we feel that the African feminists have been very lenient with culture, with the cultural practices, with our tradition as a continent, because this is where this is where male dominance has been allowed to flourish, and has been allowed to put women on the bottom of the power hierarchy. So we don't have to be very lenient. We don't have to be very lenient with male dominance, because this is the source, the main source of women on the African continent, because most of the systems, most of the mechanisms are influenced by patriarchy.
Okay, we have a lot of questions for you and only 4 minutes left. We have another question. Please, would you expand on what you mean by a single story or definition of African feminism? Secondly, what do you mean when you say that African feminism is an offshoot of Western feminism? Related to that, we also have a question asking, when you say African feminisms have supported patriarchal norms, at other times it has negotiated and collaborated, etc., can you elucidate which African feminisms this is that have done this? Often it seems you are discussing a plurality of movements and positions, and at other times it feels it is an essentializing, and so it's essentializing. So this clarity might help, as it is a huge context that you are addressing. So it seems like both questions are attending to what do you mean by African feminisms and some of the statements that you made.
Yes, we find that a plurality is problematic because this is where they have failed to really tackle the source or the root cause of male dominance. For instance, we cited the language that they use, for instance, collaborate, that they want to collaborate with men in tackling issues that are affecting women. And we find that problematic because men are actually at an advantage when it comes to gendered roles and everything that has to do with women, problems that are affecting women, because they are, like I said before, that the systems that are established, wherever the system that are in society, that are established in society, they are actually influenced by patriarchy. So they are putting men at an advantage than women. So we find that language like collaboration, we find that problematic, because how can we collaborate with men who are already at an advantage? So we need to really use language like the words that I cited in my presentation to say we want to blow, we want to destroy, the root causes of women's problems, which are actually influenced by patriarchy.
Thank you, Sviseni. In the interest of time, I would love to ask this question for Dr. Uhuru. Dr. Uhuru, can you say more about the relationship between cosmologies and historical being?
Yes, thank you for that question. So in the Black Cosmological Archive, the conception of the human is one constituted by three beings: the living dead, the living, and the not yet born. So that cosmology grounds the purpose and the life of the living in the lives and purpose and mission and philosophies and worldviews of those who have walked before them. So in historical being means that in for instance, not renunciating actual being, which, let's say, racial capitalism flattened the being to one. You espouse this one is three from the Black Cosmological Archive, which then informs a different kind of orientation to the self, to each other, and to the world. I don't know if that is clear.
Thank you. Is that sufficient for you, Tiffany? But it's pretty clear. Okay, but in the interest of time, thank you both so much for such interesting papers. We really have appreciated listening to you, and we will now move on